They threw him to the ground, accusing him of crimes he didn't commit, unaware he was the federal prosecutor investigating their department for racism. Overnight, their actions sparked national outrage, protests, and calls for justice. What happened next changed everything. But let's start at the beginning. It was a crisp autumn morning, and the sharp, clean air carried the scent of fallen leaves as Marcus Walters, a seasoned federal prosecutor, stepped into the courthouse. At 42, Marcus had spent the past 2 decades dedicated to justice, but this case was unlike any he had handled before. For over a year, he and his team had been meticulously building a case against the Lake Ridge Police Department. The evidence was damning. Data showing racial disparities in traffic stops, first-hand accounts of racial profiling, and shocking whistleblower testimonies from officers within the department who had witnessed, or even been pressured to participate in, excessive use of force against black residents. As Marcus exited the courthouse, his assistant, Claire, caught up with him, her notepad in hand. "Don't forget," she said, "tomorrow's the big interview with NBC. It's going to shine a spotlight on this case. Just be ready. They're bound to push for specifics." "I know," Marcus replied, his tone steady. Publicity was a double-edged sword, but it was necessary to expose the Lake Ridge Police Department's culture of discrimination to the world. He nodded to Claire and made his way home, mentally preparing for the next phase of the fight. But Marcus wasn't just anyone in this exclusive neighborhood. For some of the officers patrolling the area, he didn't fit the image they expected. To them, he was a stranger in their protected space. And for Marcus, what began as a peaceful stroll would soon become a confrontation that laid bare the very injustices he had spent his career fighting. The air in the park was cool and crisp, with the occasional rustle of leaves breaking the quiet. Marcus Walters, seeking a reprieve from the weight of his work, strolled along the tree-lined path, lost in thought. The fading light of dusk painted the park in soft hues of amber and gold. It was peaceful, until the low rumble of a car engine interrupted the serenity. A squad car rolled up beside the path, its headlights cutting through the growing shadows. 2 officers emerged, their movements sharp and deliberate. Marcus's instincts, honed by years of dealing with law enforcement, sensed trouble immediately. "Hey, what are you doing around here?" barked the taller of the 2, Officer Reynolds, his hand casually resting on his holster. His tone wasn't curious. It was accusatory. Marcus turned to face them, his expression calm but alert. "Just taking a walk. Is there a problem, officers?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. "You look out of place," Reynolds sneered, narrowing his eyes. "We've had reports of a suspicious person in the area." Marcus arched an eyebrow, his calm unbroken. "Suspicious? I'm walking in a public park." The officer's face hardened. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped. "ID, now." Marcus, fully aware of his rights, stood his ground. "Am I being detained? If not, I'd like to continue my walk." That question, spoken firmly but without hostility, seemed to ignite something in Reynolds. Without warning, the officer grabbed Marcus's arm. His grip was rough, his movements aggressive. "Stop resisting," Reynolds barked, twisting Marcus's arm and forcing him down onto the cold pavement. The second officer, Blake, moved in quickly, pressing Marcus's shoulders down to restrain him. Around them, a few onlookers had stopped, their phones raised. "Hey, he's not doing anything wrong," shouted one woman, her voice tinged with alarm. Another man called out, "He's just walking. Leave him alone." Thrown into the back of the patrol car, Marcus felt the weight of the moment settle on him. He knew this encounter wasn't over, not by a long shot. Once his identity was revealed, the very officers who had arrested him would have a lot to answer for. For now, though, he remained silent, his calm exterior masking the storm brewing inside. At the station, Marcus Walters sat silently in a cold, metal chair as Officer Reynolds and Officer Blake busied themselves with paperwork. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the stark interrogation room. The officer's demeanor was dismissive, bordering on smug, as they catalogued Marcus's belongings and prepared for questioning. His earlier protests of innocence had been met with thinly veiled mockery. Marcus, however, remained calm, his expression unreadable. He knew the weight of his silence, how it would force the next move from his captors. As Reynolds adjusted his chair to face him, Marcus finally broke the tension. "You might want to check my credentials," he said evenly, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made Blake pause mid-step. Reynolds scoffed, leaning back. "Oh yeah? And what credentials would those be?" Marcus locked eyes with him. "In my wallet. Look for my DOJ badge." Blake, the younger officer, hesitated, an uneasy look flickering across his face. Something in Marcus's tone gave him pause. Reluctantly, he picked up Marcus's wallet from the table, flipping it open. His hands froze as his eyes fell on the unmistakable gold insignia of the Department of Justice. Chief," Blake stammered, his voice betraying his growing alarm. "You need to see this." He bolted from the room, clutching the badge like a live wire. Reynolds frowned, his earlier confidence faltering as he glanced nervously at Marcus, who remained seated, his calm demeanor unshaken. Within moments, the door slammed open, and the police chief entered in a rush, his face pale and strained. He froze as he recognized Marcus, his expression shifting from confusion to dread. "Mr. Walters," the chief began, his voice now heavy with deference. I think there's been a misunderstanding." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his gaze cold and unyielding. "Oh, there's no misunderstanding," he said, his tone cutting like a knife. "I'm the federal prosecutor investigating your department for systemic racism, and tonight you just proved my case." The room fell into an oppressive silence, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in like a lead anchor. Reynolds paled, his earlier bravado crumbling as Blake stood awkwardly by the door, avoiding eye contact. The chief swallowed hard, his composure faltering. "We can handle this quietly," he offered weakly. By the next morning, the video of Marcus Walters' arrest had spread like wildfire across social media. Recorded by multiple witnesses, it captured every moment. Marcus calmly asserting his rights, the officers aggressively shoving him to the ground, and the crowd's cries of protest. The footage was impossible to ignore. Within hours, hashtags like "Justice for Marcus" and #Reform Lake Ridge PD were trending nationwide. The outrage was palpable. Civil rights groups released statements condemning the actions of the officers and the culture of systemic racism within the Lake Ridge Police Department. Community leaders organized rallies, while activists called for immediate accountability and structural reform. Prominent figures, from lawmakers to celebrities, weighed in, amplifying the calls for justice. That afternoon, Marcus stood before a sea of cameras and microphones at a hastily organized press conference. The room was packed with reporters, their questions flying fast, but Marcus's voice cut through the noise with calm precision. "This isn't just about me," he began, his tone steady yet impassioned. "This is about the countless black men and women who are treated as suspects simply for existing. Last night, I was reminded why this work is so important, not just to me, but to every person who has been dehumanized by a broken system. The actions of those officers were not an isolated incident. They are a symptom of a much larger problem. In the weeks that followed, protests erupted across the city and beyond. Demonstrators marched through the streets, holding signs demanding justice and reform. Marcus became a symbol of resilience and justice, his calm but firm stance inspiring others to speak out against systemic inequality. The case became a turning point, galvanizing a nationwide conversation about racial profiling and police reform. As Marcus stood once again on the courthouse steps weeks later, he looked out at the crowd gathered to support him. He reflected on the journey so far, not just his own, but that of every person fighting for justice. In that moment, he knew that while the road ahead was long, the power of truth and persistence could dismantle even the most entrenched systems of oppression.